government to guarantee the right to form unions. He developed public power in the Tennessee Valley. Electricity was brought to farmers who never had it before.
Every decision that Roosevelt made during his early presidential years directly affected my life. I was 14 years old when they turned the lights on in our house, and we did away with the kerosene lamps. And the TVA project and the farm programs had a direct effect on us.
The New Deal has been the creation of you, the American people.
He learned how to use radio, still new then, by talking in an informal way directly to the people.
Like most students, I listened to his various fireside chats. He was a magnetic personality on radio. He intrigued me as a politician. I was impressed with him as a persuader.
To get his programs through Congress, he had to be a shrewd, clever, scheming politician, which he was.
Come back with all sorts of new lessons, which I learned from barracuda and sharks. I'm a tough guy.
He talked always in idealistic terms, but he was an operator. He was a pragmatist. He punished politically, he punished his enemies, and he rewarded his friends.
Well, I was one of his enemies, and I did amend a lot of his legislation. He seized his power, and he had the power, and he cherished it, and he loved it, and he never would have given up the power, and he would have gone on, if it had been well, for 10 terms if he could have had it.
Come on and row, row, row with Roosevelt on the good ship USA. Sail with Franklin name to victory and he's honest, he's strong.
He did love the power, thrived on it. And he did bring the joys of bureaucracy to America, where it has grown and bulged and flourished ever since. His opponent in the 1936 campaign said that would happen.
He said he was going to manage the economy of the country. Well, I said that meant a huge federal bureaucracy. Well, look at the monstrous federal bureaucracy we have today.
People complain to me about the current costs of rebuilding America, about the burden on future generations. The only burden we need to fear is the burden that our children would have to bear if we fail to take these measures today.
Before he was finished, Roosevelt was elected for a 3rd term and a 4th. Nobody can do that again. We have changed the Constitution to allow 2 terms only.
Be proud to affirm when he serves his 4th term, just you wait to see. He'll make history, 'cause he's Franklin D. Roosevelt.
He would teach politicians who came after a few tricks, such as how to turn an attack to his own advantage. He answered a phony charge the Republicans put out that on a trip to sea, he had left behind his dog Fella and had sent a Navy destroyer back to pick up the dog.
These Republican leaders have not been content with attacks on me, or on my wife, or on my sons. No, not content with that. They now include my little dog, Falla. Well, of course, I don't resent attacks. And my family don't resent attacks. But Falla does resent it.
Roosevelt once said he was one of the greatest actors in the world. He could play for laughs. He could also handle high drama.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America, 1 July 1941, 1 July 1941. 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 1 July was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Roosevelt led the nation through crisis and then became an international leader in a world at war.
He mobilized American moral energies for a commitment to world affairs, and he projected America as a great force for peace and progress, and that was a major achievement.
During the war years, his military buildup began our role as a global superpower. Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, our ally then, ran the war. They even planned post-war Europe at Yalta. What ultimately happened was a division of Europe that is still painful in places like Poland. He made the decision to develop the atomic bomb. And that changed the concept of war itself. Roosevelt brought the U.S. into the great wide world it had shunned before. And he did it by doing what a leader is supposed to do. He led.
I send this Christmas message to you who are in our armed forces. In our hearts are prayers for you and for all your comrades in arms who fight to rid the world of evil. God bless all of you who fight our battles on this Christmas Eve. God bless us all. God keep us strong in the faith that we fight for a better day for humankind here and everywhere.
To Americans in the Roosevelt years, it seemed that nobody else could be president. He dominated the country and its daily life like none they had ever seen before. We talked about Roosevelt with all four living presidents.
There's no question about his leadership in that war as commander-in-chief. Our war effort was just absolutely magnificent, and we succeeded literally in saving the world.
What is often, in historical terms, debatable as to whether the events make the man or the man make the events. And of course, I would say that it's a mixture of two. In Roosevelt's case, first he had the opportunity because of events to be great. On the other hand, the way he handled those events contributed to his greatness. I would have to give him credit for that.
I think it was that optimism and exuberance and his ability to calm fears and to generate confidence within our country that made him so effective. He was also a consummate politician, which didn't hurt.
He really began the dominance of the White House over the legislative branch. It was sort of the beginning, as I look back and reflect on then and now, of the imperial presidency.
If you were to make a judgment on his overall performance as president, both in domestic policy and in foreign, how would you judge him?
I would have to say first his ability to inspire the people and get the people moving again, and his great leadership in the war have to rank him among the great presidents.
There were a few presidents who've served that I think are in the realm of greatness, and I would certainly put Franklin Roosevelt among those.
Oh, I'd put him very high. I'm sure that many of my good conservative and Republican friends would disagree, but at his best, he was really a great leader.
This is the living room of the Roosevelt House in Hyde Park. We are observing the Roosevelt centennial by devoting this entire evening to it. He was president longer than anyone ever was or will be. We'll have some pictures I'm certain you have not seen before. We'll hear from his old friends, his enemies, the juicy flavor of the time he lived, his house, a great variety of sights and sounds from our past. We will show how so much of what happens now grows out of his time and what he did, and more from our 4 presidents.
FDR continues with the formative years of the man who became our 32nd president.
The most difficult place in the world to get a clear and open perspective of the country as a whole is Washington. That is why I occasionally leave it for a few days to go back home to Hyde Park, so that I can have a chance to think quietly about the country as a whole. To get away from the trees, as they say, and to look at the whole forest.
Hyde Park meant to my father a continuity and stability and something that he had inherited through his own family. It was a way of life that he accepted and enjoyed.
He was born on the Roosevelt estate at Hyde Park. His family gave him security, comfort, privilege. Doting parents, particularly his domineering mother, Sarah, sent young Franklin into the world unafraid, self-assured, and a bit spoiled. When Franklin Roosevelt first ran for office in New York State, he walked into the local Democratic Party headquarters wearing riding clothes. One of the Pauls, fat, red-faced, and wearing a black derby, looked him up and down and said, "Roosevelt, you want to run for office? The first thing to do is get rid of them yellow pants." My colleague Robert Trout, who covered FDR throughout his presidency, beginning as a young reporter in 1933, will pick up the Roosevelt story from here. Bob, you introduced the Roosevelt radio speeches, and you were the first to call them fireside chats.
Yes, a long time ago, David. Unlike some other presidents who were born in the 19th century, Franklin Roosevelt was not raised in a log cabin. Some presidents were prepared for adversity by adversity in early life. FDR was prepared early by the feeling that all's right with the world in this comfortable house.
It was from the front porch here that Roosevelt launched his first campaign for office in 1910. The local voters hadn't elected a Democrat to the state Senate in 38 years until they elected him.
In the state Senate in New York, FDR came up against real-life situations that he had never confronted before. Problems of unemployment and long hours and low wages and unsanitary tenements and all the other urban problems of the day.
In dealing with those problems, he had a model. His fifth cousin, who had once served in the New York Assembly, Teddy Roosevelt.
What I think most impressed young Franklin Roosevelt about Theodore Roosevelt's battles were his battles against the trusts. The trusts were what we would call mergers or conglomerates today, and it meant that a few individuals wielded an enormous amount of economic power. Economic power against the worker, economic power against the consumer, and economic power against the government.
In 1905, FDR married Eleanor Roosevelt, Teddy's favorite niece. And through the early 1900s, FDR's family grew right along with his political expectation. In 1912, he worked in Woodrow Wilson's presidential campaign. When Wilson was elected, he made FDR Assistant Secretary of the Navy, an influential position once held by Teddy Roosevelt. Wooten had a way of mixing idealism and practical politics which impressed FDR. He himself was learning all about political patronage. He hired thousands of workers for the Navy shipyards. After war began in Europe, his responsibilities expanded, and FDR threw himself into enlarging and upgrading America's fleet. When America entered World War I, FDR visited the front and saw the horrors of war firsthand. Once FDR had innocently compared war to schoolboys coming to blows. He knew better after he saw what it was like in the trenches, and he never forgot.
At the end of the war, Roosevelt was a tall, attractive, athletic man who'd been a considerable success during the war, and a young man with a future. Enough of a future so that 2 years later, the Democratic Party nominated him for the vice presidency.
FDR was on the Democratic ticket with Governor Cox of Ohio in 1920. They were badly beaten. But in campaigning around the country, Roosevelt had made himself a good reputation and many new friends. He was presidential timber, they said. In the summer of 1921, the tall, athletic man with a future was struck by a tragedy that altered his life. He swam in the icy waters off the coast of Maine, near Campobello Island. Soon after, he contracted what was then a terrifying and often fatal disease, polio. Franklin Roosevelt was 39 years old and didn't know whether he'd ever walk again, much less return to public life.
And I remember as a kid, one day, it must have been early after he'd gotten polio, suddenly finding him practicing going up and down stairs with his arms, either pulling his legs up behind him or pushing his legs down in front of him, practicing this way of being self-reliant.
During the 1920s, and later when he was president, he spent much of the time in Warm Springs, Georgia. At a decaying health spa, he turned into a rehabilitation center. Hugh Gallagher, a historian, was himself treated for polio at Warm Springs.
Before he had polio, Franklin Roosevelt was, in some respects, an arrogant young man. You could never say that about FDR after he got polio. He found major frustration and learned about struggle.
After the braces began to get lighter, he found that he could walk, especially holding onto my arm and with one cane. And I've had many people tell me that they didn't even realize that he was completely paralyzed.
In fact, Franklin Roosevelt was a cripple who thereafter lived in some pain every day for the rest of his life. While FDR was struggling with polio, America was enjoying the Roaring '20s. The Republicans were running the government, and the mission of government, they insisted, was to let business alone. From the sidelines, FDR kept up an active correspondence with Democratic politicians. He later called the '20s an age of mammon, inhabited by a generation of self-seekers. The polio had not crippled his political ambition. Returning to a hero's welcome, he nominated Al Smith for president in 1924 and 1928. And where FDR could not be while he was convalescing, there was Eleanor, making certain people wouldn't forget FDR.
She was a tremendous help, a tremendous influence. And she was his eyes and his ears and his legs.
Really, it was my mother who encouraged Al Smith to ask Father to run for governor. And if Mother hadn't been there and he had not had that opportunity, he might never have gone forward to the rest of his political career.
Al Smith lost to Herbert Hoover in 1928, but FDR was elected to replace Smith as governor of New York. In 1929, when FDR went to work in Albany, New York and America were still booming. The future, said President Hoover, is bright with hope. But in the months after Hoover's inauguration, a widening gap between rich and poor had led to a general collapse of the economy. The boom went bust. Profits plunged. The stock market crashed. It was the start of the Great Depression. New York became Governor Roosevelt's laboratory for testing new ideas to deal with the Depression. He started the first state relief agency in the country to find jobs for the unemployed. Washington wasn't doing very much about the Depression. FDR obviously was. So FDR, the Democrats' leading liberal, became the party's main contender for the presidential nomination in 1932.
He knew he had to make a deal in order to win, and the deal he made was essentially a deal with William Randolph Hearst, the once radical, but by the 1930s right-wing newspaper publisher. Hearst was a supporter of the candidacy of John Garner of Texas.
We're going to win.
Roosevelt agreed to take the conservative Garner as his running mate in exchange for the votes of the California delegation, which Hearst delivered.
The people of the United States are going to elect you president, and I'm going to be vice president. I come up here to get my instructions from you, and when you give them to me, I'm going to be a good soldier and carry them out.
Well, it makes a pretty good team, and we're going to win.
FDR won the nomination and broke a tradition by flying to Chicago to accept it in person.
Let it be from now on the task of our party to break foolish traditions. Give me your help not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
During the campaign, President Hoover seemed to believe the Depression was simply going to go away. He promised that prosperity was just around the corner.
Bank failures have almost ceased. Credit has begun to expand. And every week, some improvement is recorded somewhere.
But as Election Day approached, the Depression was getting worse. Americans were eager for a change. Franklin Roosevelt, who tutored under Cousin Teddy and Woodrow Wilson, who apprenticed in the rough and tumble political world of New York, and who learned to live with a crippling illness, was chosen to lead a stricken nation.
It looks, my friends, like a real landslide this time.
On election night in 1932, just before he went to sleep, he looked at me and said, I hope you'll pray for me. And I said, well, of course I'll pray for you, but do you want me to pray for you in any particular thing? He said, just pray for that I'll have the strength to do this job.
FDR continues as Roosevelt confronts the Great Depression during the 100 days.
The law then was a new president elected in November didn't take office until March, and so a defeated president, a lame duck, remained in office 4 months. Roosevelt used the time with his own advisors planning an enormous frontal assault on depression and unemployment. They didn't know it, but they would set the direction of the U.S. government for 50 years. A government bigger, more powerful, and taking on responsibility for the economy and for the old, the poor, the helpless. An economic and social revolution. Very few of the American people had any idea what was coming.
The Depression, the great American Depression of the 30s, was a time of great despair. At one time, 16 million people walking the streets desperately, looking for work and some sense of self-esteem.
Grim, bleak, hopeless and helpless. You can't move. There's no place to go. Nothing to do. Nobody wants you. Everywhere you went, you knew, oh, let's say, a third of your friends are out of work.
The country lost its nerve because it lost its faith in its leadership.
One of the Hoover administration, the government was doing nothing about it and was saying that they couldn't do anything about it. It wasn't the government's job, it was people's job.
A phrase came into being, a word, Hooverville. Some people lived in piano boxes. Some people lived within cardboard, I mean cardboard houses. In midwinter, they lived on whatever they picked up. Well, of course, there were outbreaks, there were demonstrations, there was organizing, but the great many accepted it and blamed themselves.
There was constantly a reappearance of people doing things you wouldn't have believed 2 weeks before they could do. For example, the man who was 2 or 3 years ahead of me at Yale, a great college athlete, a good deal of a swell. He always had been well dressed. Coming up to me outside of the Grand Central, recognizing me about 7 steps off when it was too late to change his course, and dropping his eyes and coming up to me and offering me some pencils to buy. And the expression in his face said the whole thing.
Take a look at those pictures. Take a look at those farm families, those children, the soup kitchen. It shook us. Nothing like it had ever happened. I mean, had the American dream ended?
They used to tell me I was building a dream with peace and glory ahead. Why should I be standing in line, just waiting for bread? Once I built a railroad, I made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime?
A lot of American dreams had been broken by 1933. The only escape from grim reality was the movies. Everybody went to the movies.
We're in the money, the sky is sunny. Oh man, depression, you are through, you done us wrong. Oh, we never see headline about red line today.
Hollywood even set the Depression to song.
Remember my forgotten man.
The whole country, the whole world was broke. Fortune magazine counted 34 million Americans with no income at all. 1,000 families a month were being put out on the street. Thousands of others lived in fear that they'd be next, with no home and no place to go. And then the banks started to close. My wife's grandmother had her money in 6 separate banks in Toledo. They all closed. And so did most of the other banks in America. Everybody's nest egg gone, just like that.
It was a wholly new experience, and a shattering one. The only thing you could hold on to was this man.
The inauguration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 32nd President of the United States.
This man, who looked and sounded so strong and sure of himself, who said things people wanted to hear, needed to hear.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. Let me assert my firm belief, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
The way those words rang out over the Capitol, in that very instant, the country seemed to turn around.
The American people then wanted somebody to say, listen, you're all right. What are you afraid of? We have nothing to fear but fear itself, and if necessary, I'll invoke war powers. What he was going to do, he didn't know himself what he was going to do.
Tommy Corcoran was one of the new breed in Washington. Reformers, intellectuals, academics, FDR brought the best and the brightest to Washington. There was Raymond Moley and Rex Tugwell and Adolph Burley. We reporters began calling them the Brain Trust. Francis Perkins, Harry Hopkins, Harold Ickes, the founders of the New Deal, led by FDR. The first thing they did was call a bank holiday.
My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. I can assure you that it is safer for you to keep your money in a reopened bank than to keep it under the mattress.
Within a week, most of the banks were back in business. Stock prices jumped. The New Deal had begun. The New Deal was born in a flurry of legislation that became known as the first 100 days. It was trial and error. Some of it worked, some of it didn't. If one method fails, said FDR, try another. But above all, try something.
The president left the Capitol.
Roosevelt just kept right on top of the situation from the day he took office.
As the people looked to him for leadership.
He commanded the attention of the country.
You people must have faith. You must not be stampeded by rumors or guesses.
He gave everybody the feeling that we can lick this thing. He never lost momentum.
Revival of industry, redemption of agriculture, reconstruction of banking.
FDR sent 15 major bills to an extraordinary session of Congress that first 100 days. All 15 became law. The alphabet agencies, spelling a new relationship between government and the rest of us. The National Recovery Administration, the NRA, designed to get the factories going again. It set codes for wages and hours all over the country, creating 2 million jobs.
If all employers will act together to shorten hours and to raise wages, we can put people back to work.
It was government telling business what to do. Later on, business would hate that. But in the crisis, business, most business, went along and hung out the blue eagle of the NRA, the symbol of New Deal recovery.
The New Deal really was a collection of experiments. Roosevelt was a master improviser, resourceful, flexible, adaptable, sometimes not knowing just where he was headed or what all the implications of a particular measure might be, but above all, trying it.
There must be an end to speculation with other people's money.
America's money market had broken down, and repair was in order. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation insured people's savings. Roosevelt himself was dubious about it, but it was one of the New Deal's most successful reforms. Your bank can close tomorrow, but your money's safe, thanks to the FDIC. And the government refinanced home mortgages to save families from winding up out on the street. The Securities Act harnessed the speculators and saved the stock market from itself. That government leash on the bulls and the bears is tighter than ever today because of what FDR started.
He really changed the framework of the rules of the economy so that the banks, the brokers, the industrial corporations had to observe much more humane standards.
FDR moved the financial center of power from Wall Street to Washington. The barons of finance were furious, but they were in disrepute and disarray, and FDR seemed to know what he was doing.
Roosevelt was never worried. I remember once he said to me, "Do you remember what Ty Cobb batted?" I said, "Yes, sir, 400. He laughed. He said, "That was only for 2 years." Then he went back to 300. Let me tell you, Tommy, if you bat 200 in this league, you're a Ty Cobb. You're a champion.
And there were the farmers. One family in 5 was a farm family back then, and for many farm families, it was just like the movie.
This is my land. Used to be your land. It's a continent now. We come to the relief for a moment of those who are in danger of losing their farms or their homes.
We didn't know it then, but the New Deal was going to revolutionize American agriculture and restore America to being the biggest food producer in the world. The Farm Credit Administration refinanced farmers' mortgages, and the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the AAA, guaranteed them a price for their crops. In 4 years, farm income went up 50%, and Washington sent the experts to the farmers to show them how to grow things bigger and better. Even so, some farmers thought government had no business down on the farm.
A good farmer can fight his own battles and take care of his own land. And the AAA, I think, is just taking care of the shiftless ones.
Whatever misgivings there were, FDR smothered them before they got to Congress.
He was always ahead of Congress, leading it, persuading it, bribing it sometimes politically, almost seducing Congress to get these programs through.
He was the most skillful politician we ever had in the White House. He was a real politician. He knew what he wanted, and he was unscrupulous, and he didn't mind threatening these leaders if they didn't come through either. And he didn't hesitate on it.
I am confident that
and he had the power to do it.
Because of that, and because of the crisis, FDR got just about everything he wanted that first 100 days. The biggest problem was unemployment. Millions of Americans, 1 out of 4, were out of work.
Nobody knows you when you're down and out.
For the first time ever, Washington started giving people money just because they needed it. Relief was the first federal welfare, the start of the welfare state.
The outlook for relief is encouraging. An increasing number of people are going back to work. But it must be borne in mind that there are still millions in need of relief.
A lot of people had doubts about relief, including Franklin Roosevelt. The dole went against the grain of American capitalism. But capitalism was in trouble. Socialism and communism were catching on.
Well, in a way, it was a profoundly conservative, rather counter-revolutionary measure, because he knew that if you didn't take care of these people, they would become desperate and turn against the system.
Relief wasn't enough. FDR had a more dramatic solution.
To take 4 million men from the breadlines and
if business couldn't find enough jobs, government would make work. It was temporary work, but it was work. There were fistfights for shovels in some places. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, hired the young people and sent them out to the farms and forests.
I wish that I could take a couple of months off from the White House and come down here and live with them, because I know I'd get full of health the way they have. The only difference is that they've put on an average of about 12 pounds apiece since they got here, and I'm trying to take off 12 pounds.
The Public Works Administration was started with something more permanent in mind. It put people to work building bridges and schools, city halls, and county courthouses all over the country. It was the biggest construction job in American history, and it lasted for years. That's how the Grand Coulee Dam, the Hoover Dam, and New York City's Triborough Bridge came to be. And the New Deal started something else. The valley of the Tennessee River was as down and out a place as you could find in America during the Depression. Floods and droughts and erosion. Problems too big for any one state to handle, but not too big for Washington.
The Muscle Shoals development and the Tennessee River development as a whole are national in their aspect and are going to be treated from a national point of view.
The Tennessee Valley Authority used everybody's tax money to make one part of America better. In 12 years, the government built 15 dams and gave jobs to thousands. It harnessed the Tennessee River, controlled the floods, and brought power, cheap electric power, to the countryside, where before there was none. Critics said it was socialism, and it was, in a way. The TVA was government doing what the private sector couldn't or wouldn't do for the people of the Tennessee Valley.
I think of TVA like I think of Roosevelt. I think it was a lifesaver to a lot of people, including me.
TVA and all those other initials that made up the alphabet soup that first 100 days amounted to a way of using government in the United States as it had never been used before.
What primarily made possible the great speed and success of the 100 days, of course, was a sense of national crisis. When a man becomes president and every bank in the country is closed, and there's a general sense of the economy in a state of collapse and the society reaching the end of its tether, you can get a lot done.
Which camera do you want me to break?
And there was FDR, coping with America's depression and actually having fun. It was contagious.
In the mines, in the mills, and in the factories, more jobs and pay rises.
By the end of the 100 days, America was starting to work again. And more importantly, Americans were working together. That's what FDR made of government in that bright dawn of the New Deal. He was idolized in newsreels and movies. It wouldn't last. Very soon, FDR would be fighting to protect his New Deal from those who thought it had gone too far, and those who thought it had not gone nearly far enough.
FDR will continue.
He loved to sail. One of his congressional supporters told him, "Mr. President, I could tell you're a great sailor because of the way you run your leadership, the way you tack over here, tack over there to fight against the wind." Well, after the 100 days honeymoon, Roosevelt did indeed have to fight against the wind of rising opposition. That's next.
Continues with a special program on Franklin Delano Roosevelt, including interviews with the 4 living presidents. A program dedicated to the man and his presidency and how his actions affect us still today. FDR is being brought to you by the new Exxon 500 information processor. You got to see it to believe it. And Holiday Inns. Come to Holiday Inns where your smile says we are #1 in people pleasing.
Most of the American people never knew that Franklin Roosevelt, during his entire presidency, was in a wheelchair. This is one he used here in the family house in Hyde Park and had it made here by a carpenter from an old kitchen chair. He had him cut the legs off and put wheels on it. Unlike the chromium chairs we see, it doesn't make much of a show, but it didn't cost much. FDR made the beginning of his first term seem almost easy, but it wasn't so easy thereafter. The country had not changed so much that politicians and special interest groups stopped their normal clawing, scratching, complaining, and demanding. Also, those early New Deal policies did not end the depression and unemployment. So more new programs were rolled out, increasing still more government's intervention in the economy, still more programs to help those in need. Policies started then, we still live with today.
By 1934, America's political climate had become explosive. The New Deal had shown people what government could do, and now they wanted more. The demagogues began to appear. Father Coughlin, the radio priest, had 40 million listeners.
I ask you if you will rise in your places and pledge with me to restore America to the Americans.
Dr. Francis Townsend led a national movement demanding old age pensions that were disastrously expensive in 1934 dollars.
That all citizens 60 years of age or over who wish to do so may retire on a pension of $200 per month.
Senator Huey Long of Louisiana, the Kingfish, proposed to soak the rich and share the wealth with the poor.
75 to 80 to 85% of the people not only give up their property year after year, but they go further and further and further into economic slavery.
Roosevelt knew he had to head off the extremists, and he did.
But I am pushing up-to-date government in place of anti-clericalism. America calls for a government with a soul.
He sent Congress a bushel of new bills, the second New Deal, more radical than the first. The highlight of the second New Deal was a program that changed the landscape of American life. The Social Security Act, still at the heart of government assistance half a century later.
The civilization of the past 100 years, with its startling industrial changes, has tended more and more to make life insecure. This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 million of our citizens who will reap direct benefit.
The Social Security Act provided old age insurance, unemployment insurance, and help for the disabled and for dependent children.
And the prevention of ill health.
Social Security wasn't charity. You paid into it, and so did your boss. And then you collected when you retired or if you were unemployed. It was protection, like insurance, except that the insurance company was the government.
It seems to me that if the Senate and the House of Representatives in this long and arduous session had done nothing more than pass this security bill, Social Security Act, the session would be regarded as historic for all time.
The Social Security Act has transformed our lives. Before that, I don't think we have any notion how risky life was. There was no retirement. There were no private retirement programs. There were no programs for people who were disabled or blind or mothers who were widowed with children or persons who were simply sick. You died. You died early, or you lived miserably, and you lived in fear.
Other industrialized nations had similar laws, but for the United States, then, Social Security was a radical step. The naysayers said it would make Americans shiftless, that it would bankrupt the country.
This is the largest tax bill in history. And to call it Social Security is a fraud on the working man.
The president seems entirely willing to mortgage the complete future of the American people, but suggests absolutely no method for paying off the mortgage. It looks to many of us as if we're headed straight toward national disaster.
Of course, that's what a lot of people are saying today about Social Security, now that there are more old people who need it and fewer young people to pay for it. But in 1935, there were other things to worry about. People needed work. The job programs of the first 100 days had ended. The PWA was still building its great projects, but not enough to employ the millions with no jobs. For them, Roosevelt created the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, the biggest and most expensive job program of them all. Suddenly, there were 3.5 million tunnel builders and street sweepers, and you name it, they did it, for $2 a day.
WPA, WPA. Sleep while you work, while you rest, while you play. Lean on your shovel to pass time away. Take what you do, you can die for your pay. WPA.
There were even artists, painters, sculptors, writers, actors on the government payroll. The critics invented a new word for the WPA, boondoggle. It was a haven, they said, for loafers and bums and leaf rakers.
Yeah, there were leaves raked. True. And by the way, I'm sure there were loafers. But the percentage, I'm sure, was so small, it's hardly worth discussing. There was never talk about what people saw for a pittance. A play that they never could have seen in their lives before. A painting they never would have seen before. This is also part of their lives. See, man does not live by bread alone. There was an old slogan years ago, bread and roses too. WPA provided bread and roses too.
For the first time in American history, government was helping the arts and the artists. The WPA hired painters like Jackson Pollock, writers like John Steinbeck, actors like John Houseman. The arts projects were just one small part of the WPA, but they became a symbol of the humanity of the New Deal.
I think they did give a great many people a sense of dignity, a sense of identity in society. There wasn't the feeling at that time that the federal government was a nuisance and was interfering with people's lives. We were, in fact, terribly grateful for being kept alive by the government.
The WPA and Social Security intensified the opposition to the New Deal. By this time, business decided enough was enough. Businessmen were furious.
Fascism or collectivism.
Up to our neck in debt. 22 million people getting government relief.
Al Smith, who'd helped Roosevelt rise toward the presidency, turned against him and joined his critics.
After all the power and all the money, we find ourselves where? On the dead-end street called failure.
Profits were up, but businessmen felt their domain invaded, threatened as Roosevelt broke up holding companies, raised taxes on estates and profits, and worst of all, attacked them, mocked them, turned great tycoons into political whipping boys.
These economic royalists complain that we seek to overthrow the institutions of America. What they really complain of is that we seek to take away their power.
Roosevelt was far from being a socialist, but he had a strong sense that there was a national interest which he was charged to represent and which was superior to that of the interests of big business.
To the wealthy, the ones untouched by the Depression, FDR, that man with all his taxes and regulations, was a traitor to his class, a threat to it.
740 Park Avenue.
Yes. Now, if you send this to my country home in Rumson, New Jersey, would I have to pay the sales tax?
No.
Well, then you send it to my Rumson home.
Very well, madam.
I just got an invitation through the mail. Your present requested this evening, it's formal, a top hat, a white tie, a tail. Nothing now could take the wind out of my sail.
But to the working man, it was a very different world. Industrial workers had no protection, and when they sought it in the union movement, the bosses cracked down. There was violence. Union organizers were thrown out of factories. Then Senator Robert Wagner of New York introduced the Wagner Labor Relations Act, a bitter pill for business, putting the power of government behind the workers and their right to form unions.
The labor movement, as we know it today, really didn't exist before the New Deal. Auto was not organized, steel was not organized, rubber, all the mass production industries were unorganized.
Join the CIO, come and join the CIO. If you want to join a union.
And it was a pretty brutal place before the unions. Conditions were unsafe, but more than anything else, it was oppressive.
Join the CIO, come and join the CIO.
The Wagner Act lifted much of that oppression. It was the start of collective bargaining, and it set up a government board to mediate business-labor conflict.
Roosevelt was a bit standoffish about the Wagner Act. He was concerned that labor might become too powerful if there was an act that gave labor the right to organize. But again, the pressure from labor itself and the pressure in Congress was so great that Roosevelt went along, and he finally became a very strong supporter of the Wagner Act and, of course, helped put it through.
The Wagner Act was just too much for some bosses. They rebelled, and there was violence, like the bloody police riot in Chicago in 1937.
In many strike situations, the companies had the police department in their hip pocket.
The bosses lost the union battle. The Wagner Act made the big unions legitimate, gave the workers courage. They joined up, and soon big business had to face big labor. So now labor joined the others. The old, the farmers, the blacks, the poor of the urban slums. All the Americans who had government to be thankful for.
And I hereby declare...
By the 1936 campaign, the battle lines were drawn. Roosevelt had created a voter coalition that would shape the Democratic Party for the next 40 years. But as Roosevelt sought re-election, its strength would be tested for the first time. Leading the opposition, the Republican candidate for president.
Alfred Boston Landon of Kansas.
Poor Alf Landon was no match for FDR.
I do not believe that a temporary depression is adequate reason for changing our whole form of government.
Landon and the Republicans were so serious, and FDR just loved to make fun of them.
Let me warn you, and let me warn the nation against the smooth evasion that says, of course we believe these things. We believe in Social Security. We believe in work for the unemployed. We believe in saving homes. Cross our hearts and hope to die. We believe in all these things. But we do not like the way the present administration is doing them. Just turn them over to us. We will do all of them. We will do more of them. We will do them better. And most important of all, the doing of them will not cost anybody anything.
FDR's re-election was the biggest landslide in American history. Landon won only Maine and Vermont.
It's Roosevelt again.
Dorothy Thompson, the columnist, snickered that if Landon had given one more speech, Roosevelt would have carried Canada, too. The victory solidified the New Deal and gave hope to millions of Americans, still victims of the Depression that wouldn't go away.
I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. But it is not in despair that I paint that picture for you. I paint it for you in hope, because the nation proposes to paint it out.
Roosevelt's inaugural speech was full of sweeping promise that he never fulfilled. The New Deal was already losing momentum, bogging down in politics. There would be no more leaping reforms for that needy 1/3 of a nation. Despite all the New Deal programs, there were still millions out of work. FDR never did solve the eternal riddle of the American economy, how to have peace and prosperity at once.
By now, FDR's enemies were after him, and he made some mistakes. When the conservative Supreme Court threw out 11 New Deal programs, he tried to change the law and enlarge the court with justices of his own choosing. He failed, and he horrified a lot of people, some of them calling him a dictator. His second term ended in a kind of stalemate. But whatever the failings, the major New Deal reforms took root and still survive today. And something more. All through the Depression, FDR gave Americans a possible dream, the dream of recovery. By 1940, he'd cut the percentage of jobless nearly in half and doubled the national income. And perhaps most important, confidence in the nation's institutions had been restored.
Governments can err. Presidents do make mistakes. But better the occasional fault of a government that lives in a spirit of charity than the consistent omissions of a government frozen in the ice of its own indifference.
Back then it was totally different. Then the people have looked upon the government as their government. It was their government trying to do things for people.
But I think of it as a moment of great, strangely enough, exhilaration. In that, to use a cliche, that a light at the end of the tunnel, there was indeed a light at the end of the tunnel. And this light had a tilted cigarette holder turned upwards with a big grin.
FDR continues with Beyond the New Deal, and we'll see the gathering storm of war.
All the Roosevelt New Deal legislation, what has it meant to us since? Now we'll hear what 4 of our presidents who came after Roosevelt say about this, and ABC News correspondent Richard Threlkeld has a report on how government has dealt with the policies Roosevelt left behind.
I think that it is the destiny of this American generation to point the road to the future for all the world to see. I see an America where there is no endless chain of poverty, from generation to generation, a people confident in strength because their body and their spirit are secure and unafraid.
Franklin Roosevelt gave that speech one November night in 1940. If he spoke with such conviction about America's tomorrow, it was because he'd already put his stamp upon it. When FDR took the oath of office in March of 1933, Jimmy Carter was 9 years old. Richard Nixon was 20. So was Gerald Ford. And Ronald Reagan was age 22. As presidents, they were all Roosevelt's heirs. Their inheritance was the New Deal. The New Deal was simply this. If you had a problem, and in FDR's day the Depression was a dreadful problem, you turned to government to solve it. The purpose of New Deal government wasn't just to make things better, it was to make things fair. Indeed, for most people, America was a better, fairer place to be after Franklin Roosevelt.
We should expand our Social Security program, both as to the size of the benefits and the extent of coverage against the economic hazards due to unemployment, old age, sickness, and disability.
Harry Truman made order out of the New Deal, made some sense of it, struggled for it against an old deal Republican Congress.
This danger provides one of the most telling of the many arguments against over-concentration of power in the federal government.
Dwight Eisenhower made the New Deal respectable. He called it New Deal socialism, but he went right on making big government even bigger, because that's what the people wanted. It was a Republican president who started the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare.
The New Deal and the Fair Deal were bold measures for their generation. But now this is a new generation.
John Kennedy called his New Deal the New Frontier. The New Frontier was a place of great expectations that remained for the next disciple to fulfill.
We're only at the beginning of the road to the great society. Ahead now is a summit where freedom from the wants of the body can help fulfill the needs of the spirit.
Lyndon Johnson wanted to finish what Roosevelt started and do it bigger, better, faster. He let the government loose on problems in every corner of American life. We could afford it, we thought then, and the need was there.
We as a people will get to the promised land.
Because they demanded it, Johnson managed some other unfinished business, the matter of blacks. The best that can be said of the New Deal was that it was colorblind. Not a single civil rights bill ever crossed Franklin Roosevelt's desk. Lyndon Johnson wrote blacks into the system because he believed colorblind wasn't enough. The Great Society was the New Deal at its zenith. Of course, it couldn't last.
The fact is that the welfare establishment and system in the United States is a monumental failure.
Richard Nixon was the first of them to take a long, hard look at what the New Deal had become. He didn't like what he saw. He tried to change the welfare system, but the New Deal Democratic Congress wouldn't let him. And even though he said he was against New Deal socialism too, President Nixon started the Environmental Protection Agency, and that made big government that much bigger.
If the Congress keeps sending me budget-busting bills down to the Oval Office in the White House, I will use my veto again and again and again.
Gerald Ford didn't get along with the Democratic Congress either. He served only part of a presidency, and that he spent battling big government with vetoes. Jimmy Carter was the next of them.
Government cannot solve our problems. It can't set our goals. It cannot define our vision. Government cannot eliminate poverty or provide a bountiful economy.
Jimmy Carter was the most conservative Democrat in the White House in this century. He was never very comfortable in Washington, surrounded by the bureaucracy. He considered government more of a burden than a blessing. But then times had changed. Many Americans despaired of government. The Great Society had become the society of limits.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
In 1980, Ronald Reagan ran against FDR's New Deal as amended and expanded by 7 previous presidents of both political parties and won big. He senses that what most Americans want from government today is less of it. That is a popular view nowadays, and now is certainly different from then. In FDR's day, almost everybody was really poor. Today's really poor people are a troublesome, expensive, seemingly permanent minority. Today, there are 2 generations of Americans with no living memory of Franklin Roosevelt or the calamity that was the Depression. So it's easy to see government as just a big, costly brute that takes instead of gives, not the old New Deal government that meant to do so much good and did some pretty wonderful things at that. Along the way, the New Deal became a victim of its own expectations, the notion that government would always do good for everybody. That's too much to expect of any government, and it's not surprising that Americans have lost faith in it. That's not news, of course, to any of our 4 living presidents. They all had to manage with what had become of FDR's handiwork. David Brinkley talked with each of them about what Roosevelt did and how he did it.
Popular as he was, there were, as you know, a substantial number of people who hated him. Should that happen to everyone in public life, public office?
Any president engenders strong adverse feelings. People get disappointed. They listen to campaign speeches, and then they see what the reality is after a president moves into the White House. And those disappointments are reflected in what people say, how they react. No president can avoid antagonizing people.
A lot of people hated him. I suppose that's common to all public figures.
Oh, yes, I would perhaps be a pretty good witness to that effect. I would say that in Roosevelt's case, he somewhat asked for it. Roosevelt's political philosophy was it was always necessary to have an enemy. And Roosevelt, of course, attacked the princes of privilege. He said class against class and so forth. A man like that who chooses enemies, therefore, is going to have friends to balance them. So you will generally find that as far as presidents, leaders generally are concerned, that in order to have strong friends, they also have to have strong enemies.
One of the great features of the Roosevelt administration was that he led the government to take over responsibility for people who were helpless, the old, the sick, so on. Mm-hmm. How much can government realistically do for people? And has this kind of thing gone too far?
Well, I think Roosevelt would say that it's gone too far if he were here today. I don't think that he would recognize the Great Society that President Johnson initiated as being the follow-on for the New Deal. It went much further than he would have gone. So what had happened, I think, is that our programs got so big. Out of a good heart, we wanted to help people more for housing, more for education, more for the poor people. And then we went overboard, and so we finally found that it was necessary to balance it on the other side.
I think the government has become too intrusive in the lives of people. But what Roosevelt did and what the Democratic leaders have done since him, including Kennedy, Johnson, Truman, have been to recognize the innate worth of human beings and the right of a senior citizen to live their last years in dignity.
Do you think this kind of program has gone too far?
Yes, and it has gone too much to the national branch of government. Now, Roosevelt himself recognized that. Roosevelt made a statement that the federal government, you didn't call it welfare then, you called it relief. He said the federal government must and shall get out of this business of relief. And I think it's to a great and generous people. The American people always have been. There has been a bad habit developed of saying, well, isn't that government's problem? Shouldn't government do something about it? Instead of saying, shouldn't we do something about it?
In terms of providing a floor for the older people, a floor for those that can't take care of themselves, a floor for those who can't take care of their medical bills and so forth and so on, government has a responsibility. I think it can do that.
The New Deal put in a set of policies for an emergency. They became political orthodoxy, whether we had an emergency or not. What are your thoughts about that?
It's quite true. The idea that you can have a program for an emergency, and then if it is a popular program, get rid of it when the emergency is gone, it just isn't going to go away.
But I don't think anyone in his right mind would advocate doing away with the Social Security system. Roosevelt looked upon Social Security as his greatest domestic achievement, and it has served its purpose well. There may be some modifications in it to reduce payments to people who don't need them, but the security part and the dignity part that has gone with Social Security could not be reversed.
Roosevelt also pushed the government into a greater degree of intervention in the private economy and private business. Has that since gone too far?
Yes. He had a belief that government should be a sort of balance. But in recent decades, we have to realize that our government has not only had an interventionist policy, it's been almost an adversary relationship with its business community, a kind of hostility to the private sector.
I believe that in many areas, the federal government, either by legislation or by executive order, has moved too greatly into the private sector. That is, of course, one of the premises of the Reagan administration, that they're going to try and withdraw federal intrusion into the private sector. I basically applaud that approach, as long as it doesn't adversely affect the health and welfare programs or health and safety programs that are essential. as a responsibility of the federal government.
One of my major commitments as president was to deregulate the free enterprise system, and we were remarkably successful. Roosevelt imposed those original constraints in a time of crisis, when the banks had to be closed, when people's future was uncertain. And I don't criticize him at all for taking those bold regulatory actions when he imposed them.
Roosevelt told people, or persuaded people, that government could solve their problems. Why are they so disillusioned today with the government's ability to solve problems?
Roosevelt had the great advantage of being the innovator, and he could make these great, marvelous promises, and it takes a long time before people find out that the promises, the programs, which are going to solve anything, don't work. That's what the Reagan Revolution was all about in the elections of 1980. It wasn't that people were voting against better medical care, better housing, better jobs, and so forth. The point was, they realized that after all the promises and all the programs and all the billions that had been spent, they weren't getting it. So they said, let's try something else.
It may be, as the four presidents and most Americans now seem to believe, that government has gone too far. But how far is that? Certainly our government is expensive. We spend close to half our national income on it. But that's less than almost any other industrialized country in the world. Virtually all of them outspend us proportionately for education and Social Security and public health and welfare. For all its excesses, it is government that guarantees the dignity of the working man, government that stays the harsh hand of monopoly, government that provides cultural and educational opportunities for all its people, and government that ensures the elderly will live out their lives with a measure of security. More than a few of those dreams that Franklin Roosevelt dreamt long ago have come to be. It was government that made them real. Roosevelt is gone now, and so is the New Deal. America has found nothing nearly so noble to take its place.
We Americans today, all of us, we are characters in this living book of democracy. But we are also its author. It falls upon us now to say whether the chapters that are to come will tell a story of retreat or a story of continued advance.
FDR will continue as Roosevelt prepares America for World War II. Dictatorship overseas confronts America when FDR continues. Monday.
Churchill called those days before World War II the gathering storm. At first, it seemed to Americans that our two oceans would keep us out of the war, but Roosevelt would end up using all his powers of leadership to mobilize the country for a war. The stakes were the survival of democracy and freedom.
Nazism in Germany.
Ohne 3 Monate begangen sind, wird euer Terror beseitigt sein. Verwahren wir das
Fascism in Italy.
L'Etiopia è italiana.
Military imperialism in Japan. It seems as if some of the most civilized nations on Earth had simply gone mad in the worldwide economic chaos of the 1930s. While the armies of aggression were on the march overseas, at home the marches were of a different kind. Isolationism ran deep and strong in the American mainstream.
Let your fight alone battles. They mean nothing to us. I know that every person in this audience is opposed to going to war.
We want no war. I have seen war. I have seen war on land and sea. I have seen blood running from the wounded.
When FDR was running for a second term, the isolationists were a formidable opposition. The president tried to persuade the people that a vote for him was their best hope for peace.
I have seen the agony of mothers and wives. I hate war.
That speech was pure Roosevelt. He told the voters what they wanted to hear. But after he was re-elected, the president changed course. He embarked on a patient, step-by-step process to teach Americans that foreign aggression was a danger to us here at home. In 1937, Japan invaded China. FDR responded with his so-called quarantine speech.
Without a declaration of war and without warning or justification of any kind, civilians, including vast numbers of women and children, are being ruthlessly murdered with bombs from the air. It seems to be unfortunately true that the epidemic of world lawlessness is spreading. And mark this well, when an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in a quarantine of the patients in order to protect the health of the community against the spread of the disease.
Roosevelt often tended to throw off ideas in a way. Well, before he had wholly worked out the means by which these ideas might be carried into practice, on the general theory that if you start people thinking in a certain direction, that then the methods will begin to develop. And what he wanted to say there was that if aggression continued unchecked through Europe and through Asia, the United States could not hope to be safe from the consequences.
In Europe, Hitler's armies marched unopposed through the Rhineland, through Austria. At Munich, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, sacrificed part of Czechoslovakia to Hitler in pursuit of peace in our time.
We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
Within 6 months, Nazi troops occupied all Czechoslovakia. FDR made a desperate effort to keep the peace by sending a message to Hitler asking him to respect the independence of 30 separate countries. Hitler treated the message as a huge joke and recited the names of the countries to a jeering Reichstag.
Denmark, Niederlande, Belgien, Großbritannien, Irland, Frankreich, Spanien, die Schweiz, Liechtenstein, Luxemburg, Polen, Ungarn, Rumänien, Jugoslawien, Russland, Bulgarien, Türkei, Iraq, Arabien, Syrien, Palestina. That mockery was the only answer the president received. Then in September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. France and England declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. Roosevelt had foreseen the coming of the war at an early point, but still believed America would not be drawn into it.
I hope the United States will keep out of this war. I believe that it will, as long as it remains within my power to prevent. There will be no blackout of peace in the United States.
For America, the war was over there, across the Atlantic, a distant echo.
then France fell.
In June of 40, the German army had raced across France so fast that we American correspondents could hardly keep up with them. I was surprised that Hitler had picked Compiègne, a little surprised in the beginning because it was where the famous armistice had been held in 1918 when the Germans surrendered. And of course that was the reason he picked it, out of vengeance and vindictiveness. This terrible feeling that came over me as I stood there watching the proceedings at Compiègne was, it can't be true that this Nazism, this Hitlerism, was going to triumph in Europe, though it looked that it almost had.
Hello, America. This is Edward Murrow speaking from London. There were more German planes over the coast of Britain today than at any time since the war began.
Britain stood alone, the last free country between America and Hitler. Winston Churchill, the new Prime Minister, was the man for this hour.
Lift up your heart. All will come right out of the depths of sorrow and of sacrifice. Will be born again the glory of mankind.
Against the background of Europe at war, FDR was running for an unprecedented third term, breaking a two-term-only tradition.
We are not old enough to have an indispensable man. We don't have to have a third term.
Roosevelt faced a tough opponent in Wendell Willkie.
One-man rule is always fatal to democracy. And let me tell you something else that one-man rule always leads to. It always leads to the road to war.
That charge is contrary to every fact, every purpose of the past 8 years.
Contrary or not, Roosevelt knew there was a possibility of America going to war, and he felt he was the only man to get the country through it. He was thinking war, but still talking peace.
I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign war.
The president worried about Willkie and isolationist charges of warmongering. But he also worried that if Britain did collapse, America would not be prepared to fight. Taking a colossal political risk, he started the country's first peacetime draft.
The first number drawn by the Secretary of War is serial number 158.
This is the Army, Mr. Jones. No private room for telephone. You'll have your breakfast in bed before, but you won't have it there anymore. This is the Army, Mr. Green. We like the barracks nice and clean. You'll have a housemaid to clean your floor, but she won't help you out.
Not everybody was singing. The draft was very controversial, and that made another FDR move in the midst of the campaign very risky. He swapped 50 World War I American destroyers for leases on British bases in the Caribbean. He made the destroyer deal on his own, without even asking Congress.
In the whole period 1939 to 41, Roosevelt was sensitive to the question of public opinion. He saw, for example, in that time, 70% of the country in polls wanted to stay out of the fighting. Another poll showed that 70% of the country wanted to assure that Britain wouldn't be defeated by the Germans. So confronting this contradictory impulse in the nation, he tried to manage it by telling the nation that each of the bold steps he was taking toward involvement in the war were calculated to assure the peace, rather than involve us in the fighting.
Our national policy is not directed toward war.
Its sole purpose is to keep war away